Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone, and welcome to Global Insights, an interactive live-streamed panel discussion, which is the first in a weekly series of panel discussions, which will shed light on big questions facing researchers, policymakers, and planners in light of the current coronavirus global pandemic. Global Insights features panelists from leading institutions in the field of international affairs, including the American University in Washington, D.C., the Balsillie School of International Affairs in Waterloo, Canada, Warwick University in the United Kingdom, Konstanz University in Germany, and the Institute of Strategic Affairs in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Today's live stream panel is entitled COVID-19, Stress Test for the Global Economy. My name is Anne Fitzgerald, and I'm the director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and I'm delighted to be serving as moderator for today's session. A warm welcome to all participants viewing today, and there are many of you. Please direct your questions to the Q&A section on the Zoom panel down at the bottom, and we will do our best to direct those to the appropriate panelists, particularly in the latter half of the program. Today, we are privileged to host four well-known experts in the study of global political economy. Dr. R Ravenhill is a professor of political science at the University of Waterloo's Department of Political Science, for which he also serves as departmental chair. Formerly director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs, John's research focuses on trade and production, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. Lina Russell is director for the Center of Globalization and Regionalization and an associate professor of global political economy at Warwick University in the United Kingdom. She researches finance and development with an empirical focus on Islamic finance and Southeast Asia. Dr. Andros Makonnen serves as a country economist at the International Growth Center in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. His research focuses on macroeconomic issues, including monetary policy and balance of payments. We're also welcoming Stephen Sylvia today. Not sure if we have him online yet, but I'd like to give him an introduction. He is a professor at the American University's School of International Service and an affiliate professor at the American University's Department of Economics. Stephen's research specialty is comparative labor and employment relations, with a focus on Germany, the European Union, and the United States. So to kick off this session, I'd like to ask a question which predates the crisis, and I'd like to direct that to you first, R Ravenhill, and ask what, in your view, was the state of the global economy going into the current crisis?
Thank you, Anne. If I was asked to sum up the state of the global economy at the beginning of this year in a single word, that word would be brittle. In some ways, the global financial crisis of more than a decade ago continues to impact the global economy. But for today's event, I'll focus on three key dimensions of this brittleness. The first is international trade. And here, the global financial crisis marked a turning point. Over the last decade, the rate of growth of international trade declined significantly compared with previous decades. In 2019, international trade actually contracted by 0.5%. Now, multiple factors were at work here, but undoubtedly the trend was exacerbated by a growth in protectionism. At the start of this year, the trade war between the United States and China was still unresolved. The US was threatening to impose sanctions on imports of European cars. And of course, we also had the uncertainty created by Brexit. The second dimension is debt. By the end of last year, increasing concern was being expressed about the debt levels of several large economies in the global south. Argentina had already had to borrow a record amount from the International Monetary Fund in 2018. Brazil and South Africa also face debt problems, and indeed last November, the International Monetary Fund reported that 20 countries in Africa were facing problems in servicing their debts. And of course, there were also debt problems for the countries in Southern Europe. The third dimension is the failure of international cooperation on economic affairs. Now, perhaps the breakdown of the WTO, World Trade Organization's dispute settlement mechanisms, is the best known example of this, but neither the G7 nor the G20 had been able to reach agreements on key elements of international economic cooperation. So none of this bodes well for the global economy post-COVID.
Thank you very much, John. Lina, can I direct that question to you from your perspective in the UK? What do you feel was the state of the global economy going into this crisis?
I would agree with John that the situation was perhaps not the best situation to be hit by a global pandemic. Just to follow up on John's point on debt, so as trade levels went down, debt levels went up, and we crossed the 250 trillion US dollars mark of global debt levels last year. So that was already quite inauspicious situation. In addition to sovereign indebtedness, we also have significantly high levels of corporate debt and also household debt levels. So kind of quite a complex situation, which means different countries, different industries, and so on, from the outset have been quite differently exposed to the the repercussions of the pandemic. Something else I wanted to emphasize is also the kind of like growing reliance perhaps on precarious labor. So we've heard a lot about the kind of like growth of the gig economy and so on. Now that kind of poses significant challenges if you then think of how to kind of design mechanisms to kind of keep people in jobs and so on, but I'm sure we'll touch upon that later.
Thanks very much. And Dr. Tedros from Addis Ababa, give us your views, especially from a Global South perspective. What was the state of the economy going into this crisis?
I think most African countries, most developing countries have seen strong growth numbers past decades. If we look at sub-Saharan African countries, there was an upward trend following the financial and economic crisis. There was a recovery, and in that recovery period, the sub-Saharan other developing countries have been seeing a strong growth. If you take the example of Ethiopia, where I am now, we can see that the country has seen double-digit growth for a number of years. So things have been looking up, although in recent periods there have been some glitches in the system.
Thank you very much. And just going back to 2008, the global financial crisis then had been described by many analysts as the worst crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Is this the case, John, or are there differences, and what are we likely to see in terms of change?
Well, the global financial crisis may have been the worst crisis up until the current pandemic. I mean, there's no doubt that what is happening now to the global economy is far worse than happened in the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis was a classic financial crisis. It came about because of the bursting of an asset price bubble, the mortgage market in the United States. And this caused insolvency in financial institutions. What was new about it was internationalized because of the way in which financial firms packaged together mortgage debt and then sold them on to institutions around the world. At the moment, we don't know whether the current economic crisis, which I think in some ways looks much more like the crisis in 1973-74, where you had an external shock, in that instance, the huge increase in oil price rises hitting the economy. You know, it didn't start as a financial crisis. We don't know, and Lina mentioned this, to what extent the failure of individuals and corporations to repay loans will lead to strains on the financial system going forwards. And this will obviously vary from country to country. But we can certainly expect there will be a need for government bailouts in some countries. Another key difference today, I think, is that people are going to be reluctant to go out to spend money even when lockdown is relaxed. So the likelihood is that many parts of the services sector will suffer for several years to come. There will be virtually no tourism this year. Now, this will have a devastating impact on small island economies, for instance, that often depend on tourism for something like 75% of their GDP. But it's not just there. You know, tourism is a top 3 employer in 32 states in the United States. In Canada, it's responsible for close to 750,000 jobs. And then if it goes beyond this, and just to have some interesting trivia available today, I had a look at employment in the hospitality industry. 212 million people are employed globally in the hospitality industry. Restaurants employ over 15 million people in the United States, and they generate sales of over $900 billion. It's going to be a long time before this dimension of the service sector starts to come back again.
Dr. Tedros, do you want to comment on that from an East Africa perspective? Again, popular tourist destination. How much are we thinking about the impact of tourism there at the moment?
I think all service sector, mainly the tourism sector was the first one to be hit in many of the Eastern African countries, particularly here in Ethiopia. The conference tourism is very popular. The Addis Ababa is the chair for the African Union, and there were a lot of conferences held here. But now virtually all kind of travel is by and large on a halting, and that has significantly affected the tourism earnings for Eastern African countries and many other African countries as well. Related to this, there are other services or hospitality services related to these hotels. Many large hotels in Addis have really closed their doors. The Ethiopian Airlines is a big flag carrier, and it's a big player in the airline industry, has suffered because of the the decline in travels by plane. So I think that there is a serious hit on these service industries.
Thank you. Yes, we've seen British Airways announce some huge layoffs this week as well. Stephen Sylvia, welcome, and delighted to have you in. I'd just like to direct one of the initial questions to you about how this crisis has been, in your view, different from the 2008 global financial crisis. Can you give us an impression from where you sit in Washington?
Yes, thanks, Anne. It's been quite different. If we remember, the 2008-2009 crisis was a classic asset bubble bursting. What we have now is quite different. It's something that we really haven't seen before. We have simultaneous supply and demand shocks, and that's very unusual. Typically, a recession will be one or the other. A second thing is just the huge magnitudes involved. The International Labor Organization just released a study yesterday where they said over 300 million workers are going to lose their job as a result of this, which is just dwarfs anything we've seen in the past. That we're talking about unemployment at 20% levels and fall off in growth also at 20% levels for the second quarter. The one last thing that I think is very important to note is that the causal arrows are very different with this crisis than all others. Typically, you'll have demand fall off and that unemployment will be a lagging indicator. This crisis is starting with massive unemployment, and that is then in turn affecting demand. So it's a very different animal than economists are used to seeing.
Lina Russell, come in on the conversation and give us your views.
Yes, I think also something to consider is the gendered impact of the crisis. And I think that we will again see significant differences to the Great Depression at a time where kind of like female participation in the labor market was not very high, but also in comparison to the crisis from a little over 10 years ago. So John mentioned kind of the significant exposure of the services sector, the employment in the services sector, and of course this is where many women work at kind of very often not very well paid jobs. Also in terms of caring responsibilities, a lot of the countries that have gone into lockdown have kind of started with closing schools and nurseries. The caring responsibilities are still quite unevenly distributed, I would say, in many households. The long-term implications for household finances and so on. So I think this is something that we also, again, have to be aware of, and not just in diagnosing the crisis, but also in kind of finding mechanisms to redress the worst exigencies, if you sound, of the crisis.
Very good point. And in that context, John Ravenhill, what gaps and weaknesses would you say that the COVID crisis has exposed in both national and international economies?
Well, obviously on the international level, there's this problem of lack of international cooperation. I mean, the one positive thing that's happened so far is that the G20 agreed on a fairly modest package of debt suspension for the poorest countries. But beyond that, there's a marked lack of coordination. Domestically, I think there's one significant issue that people were warning about last year, and that is with record low interest rates in many industrialized economies, central banks have been robbed of a classic instrument in fighting recession. You know, the expectation last year was that there would be a slowdown in the global economy towards the end of this year. And people were saying, well, you know, we already have interest rates, 0.5%, 1%, in some cases, you know, in some countries, even negative interest rates. And so it's not possible for central banks really to lower interest rates to any significant extent. This means that there's really only one instrument available to them, and that is to pump cash into the economy. And that has to be done. And it would be stupid. And you know, there are some international instances where governments have been reluctant to do this. And I think they are going to regret it going forward. I mean, it would be stupid not to do this. It would be stupid not to be fiscally irresponsible at the moment. But you know, there are consequences going forward. And with some countries already running high budgetary deficits and some countries with high levels of debt, then there will be a reckoning coming at some point in the future.
Thanks, John. Stephen, gaps and weaknesses exposed in the national and international economies. Any comments?
Yes, I'd say there are two major gaps that have really been highlighted. One, for countries that particularly have a welfare state that's centered around work, that when you have mass numbers of people losing their jobs, that they lose access to that welfare state precisely when they need it. And countries like the United States and Japan that have their healthcare linked to work, this is particularly pressing. And one should also mention countries that don't really have welfare states at all, that when they go into lockdown, a country like India, that the people have very little opportunity to come up with alternative resources just to meet their daily needs. A second thing would be, we've really seen the fragility of supply chains, that the supply chains have been disrupted in multiple places, and some of it is directly related to the disease. One could see what's been happening in the US at meat processing plants, that the inability to separate out workers means that workers have gotten COVID-19 in great numbers, and that has led to disruptions in the food supply.
Thank you. Dr. Andros Makonnen, I'm going to come to you because John Ravenhill mentioned countries calling for the suspension of debt. Prime Minister Abiy this morning published an article in the New York Times and has not just called for the suspension, but called for debt cancellation. Any comments on that in light of these gaps and weaknesses that are opening up in national and international economies?
Yeah, I think what most developing countries are facing right now has to do the initial case. The spread of the disease has not reached in most African countries a point at which it's really straining the health sector. But the biggest impact at the moment is the balance of payments problems or the pass-through effects from the global economy that has to do with the slowdown in exports, imports, lowering remittances, and this is severely constraining the foreign exchange, capacities, the foreign exchange reserves of developing countries. And one of the issues, as John alluded to earlier, and Lina as well, is the level of debt at the moment. It's difficult for developing countries to move towards that. More indebtedness. Most countries are now really reaching a certain level that's not going to be sustainable. So I think one area where it would really help at the global level is to have some relief on the debt aspect, and that's what the Prime Minister has been pushing towards. And it would relieve. If I give you the example of Ethiopia again, we kind of allocated almost half of our export earnings towards debt last year. So it would be really a significant.
Thank you. Stephen, did you want to come and add something there?
I did. I agree with John completely that now is the time to open up the taps and to spend, because it's the only lever that we have. I think it's important looking down the road that a big issue that will be there will be who will pay for all this debt. The world was terribly indebted even before this crisis began, and there's going to be a great deal of political wrangling to figure out, do we get rid of this debt through financial repression, which would be putting restrictions on the flow of capital? Do we get rid of it through raising taxes, which would put it on the populace? Or do we get rid of it through inflation? And different groups will be hurt most by the choices that are made down the road.
John Ravenhill, I saw your hand up too. Do you want to come back in?
Yes, if I could just add to Tedros's very useful comments there and your remarks, Anne. Yes, most people would say that this suspension is not enough. Cancellation is what is required for the poorest countries. And the plan that was announced by the G20 on the 15th of April suspended $12 billion worth of payments. The United Nations estimated that up to $1 trillion is needed, not 12 billion. Another key factor here is that this G20 agreement didn't include private creditors, and they control 1/4 of the debt of poorest countries. So somehow they're going to have to be involved in debt rescheduling. And of course, this agreement does nothing for the largest debtors, the middle income countries. They were just not part of the discussion here at all. So back to Steve's point, yes, who is going to pay for this and how are we going to manage this on a global scale?
Lina, in the past, these major crises have triggered great transformations. Do you think that this crisis is going to trigger some great transformation? And if so, how would you characterize that?
Okay, so I would hope that this crisis triggers a great transformation, perhaps towards a more caring economy. It is too early to say if it will do so. I'm also probably quite skeptical that this will happen. So I think, as Andros was mentioning, in many countries, in particular in the global south, the crisis is just about to start, just in terms of the health crisis. So the pandemic is quite far away from its peak in many developing countries. I think we have already seen a number of transformations, if you so want, on the day-to-day level. So kind of that ranges from changing shopping practices. Apparently we have returned, at least in the UK, to 10 years ago when people did the weekly shop, rather than kind of just purchasing small things every day. And we also have seen changes in existential things such as burial practices and so on. So I think as researchers in political economy are aware of those kind of everyday level changes can have significant implications for how the global economy operates. But in terms of whether we will have a significant systemic change towards a more caring economy, I think that remains to be seen.
Steve and Sylvia, your views on great transformations? Will we see one?
I think we will. It is a bit soon, but I think we will. One of the things that we've been doing in the world economy for the last 30 or 40 years is taking a lot of the slack out of the world economy to make it more efficient. I think there'll be a movement more toward building resilience and building more slack in the economy to deal with sharp disruptions like we've experienced. I also think there'll be a move toward automation and toward delivery at a distance. For example, right now, instead of all of us being in a single seminar room, we're doing a seminar at distance, and different economic activities that can accomplish that, I think, will be more successful. Those that cannot will run into trouble. The third thing that I'd mention is I think there will be a delinking of work from providing other sorts of benefits from work, because we can see how that would be disruptive through this crisis. And one thing to keep in mind, this is the first time I've really become a fan of the idea of universal basic income, that I think we've really seen the benefits that providing universal basic income would bring in a crisis like this.
A big subject indeed here in Canada. John, any comments on great transformations going forward?
Yes, I'd just like to follow up initially on one of Steve's excellent points there, and that is about distance delivery. One of the things that this crisis is really going to have significant consequences for is, of course, the university system. And that's something that we're all directly involved in here, and perhaps would be a good topic for another seminar in the future. As a person wearing black here, I don't know if I want to be Dr. Doom in all of this, but I think one shouldn't forget the aftermath of the financial crisis at the end of the 1920s was the growth of fascism and the events that led to the Second World War. With massive numbers likely to be unemployed, then I think there are going to be real concerns about political stability in a number of countries. I agree with Steve about the slowing or possibly reversal of globalization. That trend, I think, one could start to see in those figures on international trade in the last decade. And I think almost certainly governments are going to be unwilling to rely on others for goods that they regard as fundamental to their national security. And their definition of national security is going to be substantially broadened as a consequence of this crisis. I anticipate that we'll see actually an intensification of regionalization. That is, in North America, there will be more reliance on Mexico as an assembly plant rather than on China. And a similar trend in the European Union, reliance on the countries on the periphery of the EU, because China is still going to be regarded as an unreliable partner.
Thanks, John. I'm going to turn to something which I hope will come with some positive feedback and less doom and gloom in terms of what panelists feel has worked in terms of dealing with the economics effect of this crisis. And how would you characterize and evaluate the policy response to date? So I'm going to take that to Lina as a first panelist.
I was just distracted looking at the Q&A, the questions. So in terms of the policy response, I think we have seen some kind of like innovative policy making. And I think in particular, if you compare to the early days of the global financial crisis of kind of 2008, 2009, 2007, probably, if you were living in the UK at that time, then I think policymakers have from the beginning been using much more of their toolkit. So I think in the mid 2000s or so, there was kind of like certain narrowing down of policy tools. And I think in some countries, at least, policymakers have been quite proactive, implementing job retention schemes, subsidizing wages and so on. But I think also on the financial side, so debt repayment holidays is something that was kind of very, very controversial during the Asian financial crisis, for example. How do you classify non-performing loans? Like after how many months of not paying interest or not paying back the capital is a loan non-performing? And now some countries have kind of implemented 6 months payment holidays, a year payment holidays even. So I think their policymakers have been quite proactive. I am focusing in my work in my research a lot on debt as well. So we've already talked about the high levels of debt, but I think also being able to access short-term, mid-term, long-term funding to fight the pandemic. And I was very keen to avoid war metaphors in this session today, because that's something which I think is not very appropriate, but to address problems from the crisis. So if you look at Indonesia, for example, Indonesia placed quite a significant bond at the beginning of April, I think, including a 50-year tranche. So if you think back at the emerging market crisis of the 1990s, early 2000s, one of the problems was the inability to place long-term debt in domestic currencies. So this kind of 50-year bond was in US dollars, but I think it's kind of like shows that some of the emerging markets have also access to kind of like a greater range, if you so want, of funding options. I think many countries, in particular in Asia, also have really worked quite hard to cultivate, if you so want, domestic pools of capital. So something I like to refer to as investors of last resort. So we know the kind of lenders of last resorts, but where countries have become more and more reliant on capital markets, it's also important to have kind of like, for example, pension funds stepping in and so on. So I think generally policymakers have been making use of a wider arsenal of policy measures. However, unfortunately, a lot of those measures are just kind of giving a relatively short-lived grace period. So if you suspend debt repayments for 6 months, 12 months, and 12 months, you still will have to decide which companies are salvageable and which companies are not salvageable. And this is really, really difficult, because it's not about a return to the status quo. So for tourism in the foreseeable future, there won't be a status quo. I think there were issues anyways in terms of environment and so on. So do you save airlines, for example, if there are significant polluters and so on? So there are a lot of political questions that we will have to ask ourselves. And I think I have to hand over to some of the other speakers now.
No, thank you. Very comprehensive. Dr. Tedros, can I come to you, because there's questions coming in focusing on Africa and what does this mean for Africa? And although we're focusing on the Global South next week, we'd like your feedback, please, on the policy response to date. What are your views?
Yeah, as I said before, we are at the early stage of the curve, if you will. But that was something that I saw positively in the response in general by many African countries, was the proactive response and the learning from other countries compared to other crises or other times. I think now information has been flowing much faster, and learning has been quicker. And again, there is this saying that, you know, whatever you do before the pandemic seems over, but once the pandemic hit, doesn't sufficient. Some people are actually viewing some of the measures taken to be a little bit stronger, to have more, in fact, to have a more tailored solutions to African countries. But in my view, I think we need to take all the learning that we can from other developed countries that have faced this, but we have to prepare ourselves in a way that is suited to a developing country context. Most countries like these have a large
Okay, Tedros, you've gone on mute, but let me just take this question to John Ravenhill. John, comments about the policy response to date?
Generally, I think the economic response has been quite impressive, and certainly in a number of countries, much more impressive than the response on the healthcare front. And what's key here really is funneling cash in a manner that enables businesses to keep going, to keep employees on their payroll until recovery. And a number of countries seem to be doing this quite well. I'd come back though to the international dimension, because this is where I think we are lacking at the moment. And what one saw in response to the Asian financial crisis and then the global financial crisis was enhanced cooperation on international economic matters. And there seems to be nothing of that at the moment. There seems to be no leadership, and I'm not sure what political will there is to sustain this in any major country.
Well, speaking about lack of leadership, possibly from the world's largest economy, Stephen, over to you. What would you say about the policy response to date?
Sure, I would agree with John and with Lina. The couple things that I wanted to add is that it is fascinating how the economic side, we did have such quick action. And I think it's because it was rehearsed with the financial crisis. So people had worked out policies and knew what to do, and government officials were ready and were able to absorb the magnitudes of borrowing that we had to do. The striking things that I wanted to mention that haven't been mentioned thus far is the extent to which the responses were path dependent. That the Germans brought short-time work out again, that the United States did a typical tax cut that is leaning toward business again, and that a lot of people, having had the rehearsal, did the same actions again. I think in this case they did fit. The one reason why I wanted to mention this is because the next step no one has rehearsed, and that is, how do we unwind this? And I think the unwinding of what we've done is going to be a lot messier, is going to have a lot more mistakes in it than the quick response that we've had thus far.
And in that context, many members of the audience are asking about regions bouncing back. Are some regions better placed than others to bounce back? Any comments on that issue? Stephen, can I come back to you?
I would say that not having a huge amount of debt will benefit those countries that reduce their debt. And this would particularly, Germany comes to mind, and even Britain, the decade of austerity that happened until recently reduced British debt, so that gives the British a little more fiscal room. And in contrast, you have countries like the United States where there isn't much room at all. I think it'll be more problematic.
John, a question particularly for you, that China may be considered an unreliable partner, which could lead to the regionalization of manufacturing. So how will this continue to affect China's role in the global political economy? Will it undercut the strength it has built over the last decade?
There's obviously a concern in China that will happen. China will retain its central position in the regional division of labor. It will itself be a significant motor, I think, of the growth post-crisis. And because of this, then the extent to which it's marginalized, I think, could easily perhaps be over-exaggerated. Industries are mobile to some extent, but they locate their suppliers in a particular place because of the concentration of skills there, because of the transport facilities, and so a lot of industries are not completely footloose. You can't suddenly move stuff out of China and put it into Indonesia, for instance, where the transport problems are so much greater. But to link this to the question about which region is best placed, then I would say, as with the global financial crisis, it's likely to be the case that East Asia is going to be the region that rebounds most quickly, in part because, as Steve said, it doesn't have the debt problems in many countries that one sees in, say, Latin America or in Africa, and because of the close integration of the economies there.
Questions are also coming in about the areas of the economy that require the most innovation and attention. So can I direct that to Lina? What areas do you think require the most attention in terms of innovation at the moment? Then I want to come and get an African perspective.
So I already mentioned the gendered impact of the crisis. So I think in the long run, we certainly have to innovate, definitely on the policy front, in how to address the gender impact. So one thing that is not a very acute issue at the moment, but that is really going to bite many women, is the kind of like a question of pension finance, for example. So if you're kind of now not able to work as much as you would like to, or you're being made redundant, or you're being put on furlough and so on, how does that then affect your pension provision in systems that you rely increasingly on defined contribution pensions? So this is something where there has been a gender issue anyways that requires, I think, quite a bit of policy innovation. In terms also, of course, of what Stephen was talking about, the kind of greater use of technology. Now the question is, how much is that even possible in some sectors that are, again, quite gendered? So in my own personal experience, we have increased technology in childcare provision significantly since the start of the crisis, by just allowing your child to watch an hour TV per day. That's first, it's not a kind of long-term solution, and it's also not this kind of like type of technological advance that we're talking, or that Steve was talking about, I assume. So again, there are certain areas where we can innovate, but there are also certain areas where we can't necessarily innovate technologically, so we have to kind of innovate in terms of policies, in kind of like social development and so on.
Dr. Tedros, can I ask you what areas of, especially the East African economies, or the African economies writ large, require the most attention in terms of innovation?
I think there are a number of, I think 3 areas, in my view, are very important. The first is, of course, automation. Automation is, in general, has been important, and this pandemic has brought such things to light. Of course, automation is a double-edged sword, so to speak. It would, change production systems into ones that don't require as much labor, which would be a disadvantage for African countries. But distance delivery is also another aspect of it, wherein a different way of using technology for labor and for production as well is the kind of innovation that we need at the moment. I think there are a number of strides towards that, and I think this pandemic pushes them over the edge to become operational. In Africa and in my country, there are a number of directives that the government was reluctant upon to implement, that it's now speeding up to make sure that they come into effect, and people are starting to use some of these automation. These have to do with, for example, banking payment systems, the different telecom-based services. This is one. And the other is instituting some sort of social security systems. African countries have shied away from even instituting the system, thinking that they don't have the finances, they don't have the capacity to. But having the system itself is important to make sure that the vulnerable parts of the population can be accessed in these kinds of serious problems. And in the future, I think these kinds of innovations would help. And the third, I think, important innovation that will be required is to make sure that people have access to finance. Access to finance is also the other. And even if you have the money in some of our countries, it will not be able to reach some of the vulnerable parts of the society. Innovating on how expanding the mobile money and other basic financial services to make sure that people have access to finance is also very, very important innovation. And there are a lot of structural problems in African countries that we need to innovate on. But I think these are coming to light in this pandemic.
Thank you. I'm going to jump in on the finance issue. We've had lots of questions about the financial institutions. If private banks are allowed to suspend the loans, will this lead to a collapse of the banking sector, especially in developing countries? Will this situation lead to bail-in or bail-out of the financial institutions? Lina, do you want to have a go at that one?
So, I mean, the question is who pays for the suspension of interest repayments and loan repayments. So I think at the moment what we see at the global level, for example, so interest repayments, the kind of IMF has a mechanism to pause that. And we also see it, for example, in the UK, where the idea is that the kind of like government would step in to take over those interest payments or to at least finance the suspension of those interest payments. So I think in the short run, that is not such a big issue. In the long run, as I already said, I mean, this is what we're having at the moment is a kind of period of grace where we can get policies in place to deal with those issues in the long run. I'm less confident nowadays that a period of grace is actually helpful whatsoever. I think, I mean, we have had periods of graces. Everybody knew there was a virus in January. Everybody knew by mid-February you have to stockpile. It didn't happen. So I think when we do the postmortem of the crisis, there will be significant concerns raised about the use of grace periods. So with regard to financial institutions and corporations that are indebted and where debt payments are on hold at the moment, I think there has to be an assessment which ones are viable businesses and concerns. I think that will be very difficult because industries won't look the same as they looked before we went into the crisis. I think with financial institutions, one of the innovations after the global financial crisis was this idea of the living will. So kind of in particular big financial institutions of kind of significant importance in domestic and international financial system have to plan for their own resolution. Now I think it is of very, very great urgency to look at those living wills, which I think in some countries have started to be submitted, in other countries that's just kind of planned for the future. So we have to look at the requirements, and are those requirements, do they match the requirements that we have now with the global pandemic, where of course the kind of like big issues in financial resolution is perhaps not so much some kind of transactions where nobody knows what actually happened, kind of John alluded to previously with a lot of the kind of securitization structures and so on, 2008, 2009, but it's kind of like how do institutions deal with non-performing loans? What does that mean for the overall business? Does it threaten those institutions? And if it threatens those institutions, have they kind of like thought about it, planned for it, and implemented plans to address it?
Thanks very much. Lots of questions coming in on the future of the global international order and the future of global cooperation. What does it look like? John, can I ask you your thoughts on that question?
I'd say again, Anne, it's too early to tell. The signs up until now have not been positive. I mean, I would like to hope that countries are going to sit back, governments are going to sit back and reflect on where we are and what is needed going forward. And these various challenges that all of the panelists have outlined in terms of how we're going to manage the emergence from the current crisis situation. It's, I think, very much going to depend upon leadership. And where will that leadership come from going forward? Many people think that one of the most effective leaders in recent years has been Dr. Merkel, but she is about to disappear from the scene. Will we find leadership from Macron, for instance? What will the situation in Washington be after November? We in Canada always like to talk about the role that middle powers can play in leadership. To what extent can Canada join forces with other similar-minded countries to try and push for a more comprehensive international agreement on addressing some of these issues? These are not really very helpful answers. I mean, it's more questions than answers, but I think that's where we are at the moment.
Stephen, any comments on that? What does future international cooperation look like? What do we want it to look like?
Well, clearly the election in the United States this November will be crucial because one of the elements of the contest will be President Trump's America First view of how to approach things versus Joe Biden, which would have more of the traditional post-war American cooperative approach towards dealing with issues like this. So I think things really swing on the outcome of that election because it is just a reality that when one goes around the world and looks at world leaders, that there is no other country that's in a position to be able to be the linchpin outside of the United States, that the European Union is not able to pull together with a single leader. Great Britain is significant, but it's very difficult for Britain, particularly now that it's out of the European Union, to play that sort of leadership role. And Japan and China traditionally have not. I don't think Narendra Modi is someone who is of the inclination to pursue that because he has more of an India first policy in approaching international affairs. So it is a very difficult circumstance, and I do think the swing event will be the election in November here in the United States.
Thank you very much. If you had, all of you as panelists, an audience of global leaders in front of you, and you were asked for recommendations on policy moving forward, what are the sorts of ideas that you would put to them? Lina Russell.
I would return to the topic of debt relief. I think that is kind of like very important to think about already now, even though we have perhaps a little bit of time, like a few weeks of time to think about how to do that best. I think on the one hand, it's kind of like writing off debt, but I think also in the long run, now for 30 years or so, we've been in a kind of perpetual cycle of debt restructuring, market-driven debt switches, kind of creditor clubs on the kind of like bilateral, multilateral, private level, and so on. And it's just kind of, I think, in the long term, that just benefits those who either deal in distressed debts or get commissions and fees from those endless restructuring. So I think we have to think about new financing instruments. I think on the sovereign level, that could be some form of perpetual debt, where we would kind of continue having, after having debt relief, certain kind of like cash streams for pension investors and so on, but not this kind of like debt that is never going to be repaid anyway. So I think I would just wish for a little bit more honesty in accounting for those debt levels. I think the kind of like gender issue is something that has to be addressed. I think also kind of like questions of household debt and corporate debt. So I think, I mean, in the US, Stephen mentioned the link of medical benefits to being in employment, but I think there's also a link to high household debt levels being caused by medical debt. And I have no idea how the crisis, I mean, people must have kind of like incurred massive debts just over the last 6 weeks or so. So that is something that should be addressed. I also think that there are questions about coordination in terms of procurement of PPE, distribution of PPE. Southeast Asia is a little bit advantaged because they're producing a lot of the PPE, kind of top glove makers and so on. But I think given that, yes, the crisis hits everyone, but it unfolds with very different temporal dynamics. So I think there is a need for some creative, not just thinking, but action in terms of how to coordinate that on a global level. And also in terms of supply chains. So I think in the long run, in the midterm, there will be a need for physical distancing. So how can that be integrated in supply chains? As we talked about, there are certain jobs, industries, and so on. The physical distancing is just very difficult to implement, if not impossible. So how can that be addressed in a socially just way?
Thank you. I want to come to Teddy. Teddy, and the rest of the panelists, in 1 minute, if you can, give us some of your top recommendations that you would put forward to policymakers right now.
Well, I would recommend to policymakers first to believe that we are all in this together, and there has to be some sort of comprehensive measure rather than, individual country-based focus. At the same time, it's very important to understand specific circumstances of specific country before moving, and not to mimic solutions for all countries in the same way. And I would also like to second Lina's debt relief measure for policymakers as well.
Thank you. Stephen, tell us your thoughts.
Yes, I'd say two things. One, I would echo what Tedros said about building a welfare state for countries that don't have them. We've seen that welfare states are not luxuries, they're necessities. The second thing that I would say is this crisis highlights to me big things that that one can easily let go if one's taking an incremental view. And the thing that I'm thinking of is climate change, that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and that if policymakers, the sooner they take steps to help address climate change, the better off we'll all be.
John, any last comments on policy
Yes,
recommendations?
just one sentence to add to those very helpful comments from my co-panelists. I'd focus on international trade. I think there needs to be an international agreement on winding back those tariffs and non-tariff barriers that have been imposed in the last 3 years. I mean, that's really not, in one way, moving us forwards in terms of making things enormously better than they were 10 years ago, but at least it's undoing some of the damage that's been imposed on the system.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists. I'm sure the audience will agree that this has been a compelling, timely, and very relevant session. We didn't quite get through all the questions, but some of them will be very much relevant to next week's discussion, which we hope you'll all tune into, same time, same day, and same link. A panel entitled COVID-19 and the Global South. So thank you very much for joining us today. Again, thank you to all the panelists, and until we see you next week, take care and stay safe.